The letter arrived on a Tuesday, slipped beneath the agency's front door like something shameful. Margaret Holt, who ran the Westward Hearts marriage agency out of a cramped office in Billings, read it twice before she let herself react. Then she picked up her coffee cup and set it back down without drinking from it. The letter was from Dale Pruitt. He was 41 years old, owned the largest feed supply operation in Red Hollow County, and had been the agency's most referred client for 3 consecutive years. He had recommended 6 paying customers. He had sent a bottle of bourbon at Christmas. And now he had written, in his neat accountant's handwriting, that the agency ought to be ashamed of itself for even considering Clara Whitmore as a match candidate. She is 58 years old, he wrote. Her hands look like a man's. She buried 1 husband already and probably worked him to death. No self-respecting rancher in this territory wants what's left of a woman like that. You'd do this county a favor by sending her back east where she came from. Margaret folded the letter carefully. She walked to her window and looked out at the frozen street below. Then she picked up her pen and wrote Ethan Caldwell's name at the top of Clara Whitmore's file. If you've ever been told your best years were already behind you, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, hit that like button, and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Because what happens next in Red Hollow, Montana is something none of them saw coming, and neither will you. Cold came early to Red Hollow that October, the way it always did without apology, without warning. Just a hard shift in the air that turned breath visible and made the ground ring like iron underfoot. Ethan Caldwell noticed it the way he noticed most things lately, as one more problem he did not have the energy to properly address. He was standing in the yard when the buckboard from Milner's livery came up the main road, and he already knew who was on it. Was on it before the driver pulled the horse to a stop. The agency had sent a telegram 3 days prior. Your match arrives Thursday. Name Clara Whitmore. Age 58. Widow. Former farm operator, Eastern Nebraska. He'd read it 4 times. Not because the words were hard to understand, but because he kept expecting them to say something different. His neighbor, Frank Delacroix, had laughed so hard he'd had to lean against a fence post. 58. Frank had repeated, wiping his eyes. Ethan, she's old enough to be your mother. She's 19 years older than me, Ethan said. It's not the same thing. Close enough that people talk. People already talk. Frank had gone quiet at that because it was true. Red Hollow had been talking about Ethan Caldwell for going on 4 years, ever since the Garrett business, ever since the partnership dissolved, and half his herd went with it, and the bank started sending letters with increasingly formal language. The town had watched him shrink. He'd watched himself do it too, from some distant, dissatisfied corner of his own mind, and hadn't known how to stop. He'd contacted the marriage agency in March, half out of desperation and half out of some stubborn conviction that he was tired of eating alone. When they asked him what he was looking for in a wife, he'd stared at the intake form for a long time. Someone who won't be scared off by hard winters, he'd finally written. Someone who knows what work actually is, not looking for decorative, looking for capable. He'd felt foolish writing it. He'd sent it anyway. The agency had initially offered him 3 candidates, all of them between 26 and 34, all of them photographed in Sunday dresses with their hair done. He'd looked at those photographs for 2 evenings and felt nothing except a vague, grinding guilt. These were young women with their whole lives still open, and he'd already spent the best parts of his. It didn't sit right. He'd written back and said so. That's when Margaret Holt had written him a careful, professionally worded letter, suggesting he might want to reconsider his expectations. And attached to that letter, almost as an afterthought, was a single page about Clara Whitmore. No photograph. Just a description widowed 12 years ago, operated a 300-acre farm in Nebraska for 8 of those years, before drought made the land unsustainable. Strong health, no dependents, direct in manner and not given to complaint. He'd requested her file the same afternoon. Now the buckboard was stopped in his yard, and the driver was climbing down, and Ethan stood there with his hands in his coat pockets, feeling thoroughly unprepared for whatever was about to happen. Clara Whitmore stepped down from the buckboard without help. That was the first thing he noticed. The driver had started to reach up to assist her, and she'd already moved past the gesture, not rudely, just efficiently, like she'd been getting herself on and off conveyances for several decades and didn't require an audience for it. She had a single trunk, dark brown leather, worn at the corners. She was wearing a gray wool coat, practical boots, and a scarf the color of dried grass. Her hair was mostly white, pulled back with a kind of thoroughness that suggested she didn't think much about how it looked, only that it stayed out of her way. She was shorter than he'd expected. That surprised him, though he couldn't have said why he'd expected anything in particular. She looked at the house first. Her eyes moved across the front of it, with the focused attention of someone making an assessment, not a social impression. He watched her take in the sagging porch rail on the left side, the window on the upper floor where the caulking had gone bad and left a dark stain down the siding, the woodpile that was adequate but not as large as it should have been for the season. Face didn't change, but something in her stillness told him she'd registered all of it. Then she looked at him. "Mr. Caldwell," she said. Her voice was lower than he'd anticipated. Clear. "Mrs. Whitmore." He came forward and took her trunk before she could reach for it. "How was the train long?" She looked past him toward the barn. "Your sorrel mare is favoring her left front leg." Turned. Molly was in the small paddock beside the barn, and yes, now that he looked, she was standing with her weight shifted, keeping that hoof raised slightly. He'd noticed it that morning, and told himself he'd look at it later, and then forgotten. "I'll see to her," he said. "You'll want to check the shoe first. Might just be a stone." Clara picked up her own traveling bag, the smaller one she'd been holding, and looked at him with an expression that was neither warm nor cold, just patient. "Where should I put my things?" The house was cold inside. He'd meant to have the stove going before she arrived and hadn't managed it. He showed her to the bedroom he'd prepared, which meant he'd put clean sheets on the bed and moved a stack of books off the dresser, and she set her bag down and looked around without comment. "Supper," he said. "I have provisions. I don't cook with any particular skill." "That's fine." She turned to face him. "I'd like to unpack and wash my hands. Then I'll start supper and we can talk." "You don't have to start cooking tonight. You just got here." She looked at him, the way he imagined she might look at a fence that was standing in the wrong place. "I've been sitting for 2 days. I'd rather do something useful." He left her to it. He went out to Molly and crouched by the mare's left front hoof and found the stone immediately small, wedged up near the frog, not deep enough to cause real damage, but uncomfortable enough to make the animal miserable. He worked it free with his knife and stood up, and Molly shook her head and shifted her weight back to normal. He stood there for a minute in the cold. The woman had noticed his horse's lameness from 40 feet away after 2 days of train travel, before she'd even set down her bag. He didn't know what to do with that. Inside, when he came back in and washed up at the basin, he found Clara already moving around his kitchen with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood kitchen geography where things ought to be, even if they weren't currently there. Found his salt, his lard, his dried beans a pot. She was examining a jar of canned tomatoes with mild suspicion. "When were these put up?" she asked without looking at him. "Neighbor woman. Last summer, I think. They're fine then." She set them on the counter and moved to the stove. "I usually just do salt pork," he said. He leaned against the doorframe, feeling somewhat unnecessary in his own kitchen, and whatever bread Granger's store has left. "Salt pork is hard on a body in winter. You need more fat and something green when you can get it." She was working as she spoke, not lecturing, just stating things the way you stated weather. "Do you have any stored carrots or turnips?" "Root cellar. Left side, middle shelf." She nodded. He went and got them. They didn't talk much while she cooked. He sat at the table and tried to remember the last time someone else had been in this kitchen making a meal. His wife Catherine had died 9 years ago, fever, fast and brutal, the way fevers tended to be out here. He'd done for himself since. He wasn't someone who fell apart, but he also wasn't someone who'd done much more than maintain. There was a difference, and he'd known it, and he'd mostly tried not to think about it. Clarissa set a plate in front of him and sat across the table with her own. The food was good, not elaborate. Beans with the tomatoes, the salt pork cut small and rendered out, the carrots cooked soft. But it was seasoned properly and hot through, and there was a particular satisfaction in it that his own cooking never managed. He said so. She looked at him over her plate, with a measured expression. Just supper. I know, but it's better than what I usually have. She accepted that without false modesty or unnecessary response, which he appreciated. Some people couldn't take a simple compliment without performing something around it. Agency's file on you said your farm failed in the drought, he said. He hadn't meant to say it so bluntly. He wasn't good at working up to things. Clara's fork paused over her plate for the length of one breath, then continued. The land failed. Not the same thing, no. I suppose it's not. I kept it going 6 years longer than most people thought I could. She said it without heat. Fact. When the water table dropped the 3rd year running, and the well started giving bad water, I knew we were done. There's no fighting a water problem that far down. I sold what I could, paid what I owed, and closed it out. Sounds like you managed it well. I managed it the only way worth managing anything. I didn't pretend it was better than it was. She took a drink of water. Why did you ask the agency for someone my age? He hadn't expected her to ask that directly. Then, direct was apparently her way. Because I needed someone who'd actually done things, he said, not someone I'd spend the first 3 years teaching. He paused. And because I thought a younger woman deserves a better situation than this one. My ranch is behind. I've got more debt than I'd like and more problems than I've solved. It didn't seem right to bring someone young into that. Clara looked at him steadily. And you thought an older woman wouldn't mind the difficulties. I thought an older woman might understand them. There's a difference. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind came up hard against the side of the house, and somewhere in the eaves something creaked and popped. Town thinks you've lost your mind, she said. The town's probably not wrong. They were talking about us on the platform at Milner's station. 2 men. Neither of them thought I could hear. He felt a flash of something embarrassment, anger. He wasn't sure. What did they say? Nothing that matters. She stood and took her plate to the basin. Words don't keep cattle fed. He watched her rinse the plate with the economy of someone who'd learned long ago not to waste water. There was a particular quality to how she moved that he was still working out, not graceful, not deliberately efficient, just utterly without self-consciousness. She wasn't performing anything. She was just present. I want to be clear about something, she said, her back still to him, her hands in the basin. Go ahead. She turned and looked at him. I'm not here because I had nowhere else to go. I had options. None of them felt right. She held his gaze without tension. I'm here because I still have work in me. I'm here because a working ranch needs 2 people who are both actually working, and I intend to be one of them. Ethan nodded slowly. That's what I'm counting on. Good. She dried her hands. Then we understand each other. He helped her carry her trunk up the stairs after supper. It was heavier than it looked. She had tools in it, he discovered. A good knife, a folding awl, a small set of veterinary instruments wrapped in oiled cloth. He didn't comment on it. At the door to her room, she paused. That porch rail on the left side needs replacing before it falls on someone. If you have the lumber, I can do it tomorrow. I have the lumber, he said. She went inside. He stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the windwork around the house, and then he went to his own room and lay down on his bed, still mostly dressed. Stared at the ceiling and thought, she is not what I expected. He wasn't sure yet if that was a problem. Outside, Red Hollow was quiet, except for the wind. Inside the Caldwell house, for the first time in 9 years, there were 2 sets of sounds in the evening. 2 people settling into separate rooms. 2 different kinds of breathing, making the same old walls feel inhabited instead of merely occupied. Ethan didn't sleep for a long time. He was thinking about the way she'd said, I still have work in me, not as a plea, not as a defense, but as a simple statement of fact, the way you'd say the sky is clear or the season is turning. He'd spent 4 years doing the math on what he'd lost and what was left, and most of the answers had come up short. He'd built a life around managing the loss rather than trying for anything beyond it. The woman across the hall had done the same calculation, he suspected. She'd run the numbers on what drought and time and widowhood and other people's dismissal had taken from her, and she'd come up with a different answer than he had. He didn't know yet what her answer was, but he thought lying there in the dark, listening to the wind push against the walls that he might want to find out. In the morning, the temperature had dropped 8 degrees. Clara was already in the kitchen when he came downstairs. The stove was going, the coffee was made, and she was standing at the window, looking out at the yard with her arms folded and an expression on her face that he was beginning to recognize as her version of deep thought. "What is it?" he asked. "Your south fence," she said, without looking away from the window. "2 posts are leaning. If we get this kind of snow they're saying is coming, that section will go down and you'll have cattle on the road by January." Poured his coffee and looked out alongside her. From the kitchen window, you could just see the corner of the south pasture fence line, and yes, 2 posts with a visible lean, the wire sagging between them. "I've been meaning to fix that," he said. "Meaning to doesn't keep cattle in the pasture." It wasn't cruel. She said it the same way she said everything as simple observation. But it landed somewhere in his chest that was still tender, because she wasn't wrong. And the fact that she wasn't wrong was the whole problem. He'd been meaning to do a dozen things for a year or more. Meaning to had become a kind of permanent residence. "After breakfast," he said. After breakfast, she agreed, and turned to pour her own coffee. They went out together to the south fence line after the meal, carrying tools and wire and replacement posts loaded in the back of the farm wagon. The ground was hard enough that setting new posts was slow, grinding work. You had to chip at the frozen surface first, which took longer than the actual digging. Clara didn't ask him to do it for her. She picked up the post hole digger, found the rhythm of the work, and did her share without commentary. He watched her sideways when he thought she wasn't looking. Her technique was correct. Not masculine, just correct. She knew how to angle the digger, how to twist to break the frozen soil, when to use force and when to change approach. She'd clearly done this before, probably more times than he had. After the second post was set and they were tamping the soil back in, Frank Delacroix appeared on the road with his own wagon, heading toward town. He slowed his horse and looked at them over the fence line. His eyes moved from Ethan to Clara, taking in her work coat, the mud on her knees from where she'd crouched to examine the fence anchor, the post hole digger still in her hands. "Morning, Ethan," Frank said carefully. "Morning!" Frank's gaze returned to Clara. "Ma'am, good morning," Clara said. She didn't stop working. Frank watched her for a moment, visibly rearranging something in his head. Then he looked back at Ethan, with an expression that was considerably more thoughtful than the one he'd worn during that conversation about the telegram than telegram. He nodded once, clicked to his horse, and kept going. Clara didn't acknowledge the exchange. She picked up the wire stretcher and moved to the next section of fence. Ethan thought about what he'd told Frank before Clara arrived, about what the town expected, about what he'd expected himself. None of it was matching what was actually happening, and the gap between his expectations and the current reality was doing something uncomfortable to his certainty that he'd made an unusual choice. Maybe he'd made the right one. He didn't say that out loud. It was too early. They'd known each other less than 24 hours, and the ranch still had a dozen broken things, and the winter was still coming, and the bank letters were still sitting on his desk under a coffee mug he used as a paperweight to keep himself from reading them too often. Standing in the frozen field, repairing his fence line alongside a woman who knew without being told which posts needed, replacing Ethan Caldwell felt, for the first time in a long time, something that wasn't quite hope, but was at least in the same direction. The wind picked up from the north as they finished the last post. Clara tilted her head slightly, reading it. "That's a hard wind," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. "Yeah," he said, "it is." Neither of them moved yet. They stood at the fence line, with the empty wagon behind them and the pasture ahead, and the cold came in steady and certain off the high ground to the north. And somewhere in the middle distance, Ethan's cattle moved slowly through the frozen grass. Clara watched the cattle the way she'd watched everything, with her full attention, missing nothing. "How many head?" she asked. 63. Should be closer to 90 by now. What happened to the others? He was quiet for a moment. "Bad year," he finally said. "And the year before that wasn't much better." She nodded. She didn't ask for the story behind it, not yet. But her expression told him. She understood that bad year was shorthand for something that still hurt, the way those phrases always are. She picked up her tools and walked back toward the wagon, followed. Behind them, the repaired fence stood straight and solid against the pale winter sky. Small, 2 posts out of a dozen problems, but straight, solid. It was something. The fence posts held through the first hard frost. Ethan noticed because he checked them something he'd gotten into the habit of doing in the mornings when he walked the south pasture line, which was itself a habit he hadn't had before Clara arrived. Before, he'd checked fences when something broke, or when a neighbor mentioned seeing cattle cinched somewhere they shouldn't be. Now he walked the line every other day because Clara had said, without particular emphasis, that a fence problem caught early costs an hour, and a fence problem caught late costs a week, and that had lodged in him the way simple, true things do. The first 2 weeks had a particular texture to them that he'd have had trouble explaining to anyone who asked. They weren't comfortable. Exactly 2 strangers. Sharing a house and a working operation doesn't settle into comfort overnight, and he wasn't naive enough to expect it. But they weren't uncomfortable either. They were something more like careful, deliberate. 2 people paying close attention to each other without making a performance of it. Clara moved through the ranch the way she'd moved through the kitchen on that first night, not asserting herself, just working. She'd repaired the porch rail the morning after she arrived, and she'd done it properly, notching the new post at the base the way you were supposed to for a lasting fit, rather than just nailing it plumb and hoping. He'd come out to find her halfway through it and offered to take over, and she'd looked at him and said, "I've started it. I'll finish it," in a tone that wasn't hostile, but made it clear she wasn't asking for rescue. He'd gone back inside and poured another coffee and felt somewhat chastened, which was a feeling he hadn't had in years and wasn't entirely sure how to handle. The town, meanwhile, was doing what towns do. Red Hollow wasn't large, maybe 400 people. If you counted the outlying farms, fewer if you counted only those who came into the central settlement with any regularity. It had a general store, a blacksmith, a doctor who also pulled teeth, a feed store that Dale Pruitt had owned since his father died, 2 saloons, a small schoolhouse, and the particular social ecosystem of a community that had been watching each other too closely for too long. News traveled the way. Water travels finding every low point, filling every available space. And the news of Ethan Caldwell's unusual marriage arrangement had found all of them. Clara encountered it for the first time at Granger's store, 8 days after she arrived. Ethan had sent her for salt and a particular size of wire staple that Granger kept in stock, and he'd given her the wagon and written the list in his careful, slightly cramped handwriting. He hadn't thought about what the errand would mean. For her, he'd been thinking about the supply list, not about the fact that it was her first time in town, alone. He thought about it later. He should have gone with her. By the time Clara returned with the salt and the staples, and a small jar of coffee that had been on the list, but apparently hadn't made it onto the paper, her expression was the same as always, composed, steady, giving nothing away. But she set the supplies down on the kitchen table and then stood at the window for a moment longer than was necessary. "How was Granger's?" he asked. "Fine." She began putting things away. "Clara," she paused. 3 women, she said. In the dry goods section. They weren't quiet about it. He set down the piece of harness he'd been mending. "What did they say? That you needed someone to keep house for you, and so you'd taken in an old woman who was grateful to have a roof." She put the salt on the shelf with particular precision. "One of them thought it was charitable of you." The word charitable came out of her flat and even, but he'd been learning her long enough, or maybe just paying close attention enough to know that flat and even wasn't the same as unbothered. They're idiots, he said. They're not idiots. They're people who look at what they can see and draw the obvious conclusion. She turned around. I'm 58 years old. I arrived with one trunk. You're a younger man with a struggling ranch. The obvious conclusion isn't completely unreasonable. The obvious conclusion is wrong. Yes, she looked at him directly. It is. But I'm not going to argue about it in Granger's store. No, neither would I. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, almost to herself, I've been looked at that way before. I survived it. He believed her. But he also noticed that she didn't say it didn't sting, because some things sting regardless of how many times you've survived them. The man she was referring to, though neither of them said his name was Dale Pruitt. Ethan had known Dale for the better part of 15 years in the way that you know people in small places, not well enough to call a friend, well enough to understand the shape of them. Dale was prosperous and knew it. He'd taken over his father's feed operation and expanded it, and that expansion had given him a particular confidence that sometimes tipped over into something less generous. He was the kind of man who believed that success was evidence of character rather than circumstance, and who therefore extended that logic in both directions. Dale had come by the ranch on the third day after Clara arrived. He'd tied his horse at the post and come to the door and knocked with the authority of someone who expected to be let in immediately. And Ethan had answered with his coat half on because he'd been on his way back outside. Ethan. Dale had looked past him into the house, clearly trying to see Clara. Dale. Ethan hadn't moved from the doorway. Heard your situation arrived. There was something compressed in the word situation that was doing a lot of work. My wife arrived. Yes, Dale had looked back at him. Ethan, 58 years old. Come on now. I know how old she is. I'm the one who requested her file. I wrote to the agency, Dale said. He'd said it like he was expecting credit for it. Ethan went very still. What? I wrote them a letter before she came, told them they ought to reconsider. Dale shrugged as if this were self-evidently a reasonable thing to do. Someone had to say it. You're 40 years old. You could have a young wife, start a proper family. Get off my property, Dale. The silence that followed was the kind that changed things. Dale's face shifted through several expressions: surprise, then something that wanted to be injured dignity. I'm trying to help you. No, you're not. Ethan held the door. You wrote to the agency to stop a woman you don't know from having options she'd already earned. That's not help. I don't know what it is, but it's not that. Get off my property. Dale had gone. He hadn't said anything on his way to his horse, which was more alarming in some ways than if he'd argued, because men like Dale Pruitt didn't absorb a humiliation quietly. Ethan hadn't told Clara about the letter. He'd told her that Dale had come by, because she'd seen the horse tied outside and would have asked. He'd said it was nothing important. She'd looked at him with the patient, measuring expression she got when she thought he was leaving something out, but she hadn't pushed. He'd find out later that she'd already figured it out. The weeks moved. The cold deepened. The ranch began to have the particular feeling of a machine someone was finally running at the right setting, not smoothly, because ranches in winter never run smoothly, but purposefully. There was a difference. Clara had taken on the cattle feeding rotation without being asked, working it alongside Ethan in a rhythm they'd arrived at. Without much discussion, he took the north pasture animals. She took the south. They met in the middle at the big water trough. That was always the first thing, to freeze. She'd rigged a better cover for the trough, using materials she'd found in the barn, a stretched canvas frame that slowed the freezing significantly, which meant less time every morning spent breaking ice, which added up to something real over the course of a week. Small things, practical things. The accumulation of them was significant. You've been keeping cattle in winter your whole life, he said one morning at the trough, watching her secure the canvas edge against the wind. Since I was 14. She tucked the edge under a weight stone. My father had a problem with cold as a concept. He believed winter was something you endured rather than prepared for. We lost animals every year. That sounds hard. It made me particular about preparation. She stood up and looked at the setup with the critical expression she got whenever she'd done something and wasn't sure it was quite right yet. The canvas should be heavier. This will do for now, but I want to replace it before February. Got a piece of old wagon cover in the barn. Heavier weight. That'll work. She picked up her bucket and started back toward the barn. He fell in beside her. The ground was iron hard under their boots, and the sky had the flat, bright quality of deep cold, no weather in it yet, but the kind of clear that could change by afternoon. 14 is young to be managing that kind of responsibility, he said. 14 is when my father decided I was old enough to be useful. There was no particular feeling in her voice when she said it. He wasn't wrong. I just would have preferred to have been asked. Thought about that. What happened to him? He died when I was 26. Heart. In the field, working, which is what he would have wanted. She paused at the barn door. He never told me I'd done a good job. Not once. But he kept giving me harder things to do, which I eventually understood was his way of saying the same thing. Ethan held the barn door while she went through with her bucket. My father was like that too. Most of them were back then. She set the bucket on the shelf and turned around. Does it still bother you? Less than it used to. He latched the door behind them. I used to think I needed him to say it. Took me a while to figure out that what I actually needed was to believe it myself. Clara looked at him with an expression that was evaluating something. Not him, exactly. More like she was weighing something he'd just said against something she'd already thought. Smarter than most people give you credit for, she said finally. Frank Delacroix says, I'm the biggest fool in Red Hollow County. Frank Delacroix didn't fix his own fence line before the first hard frost. She picked up her work gloves off the shelf where she'd left them. He had cattle on Morgan's Road in November. I saw them when I was coming in on the buckboard. Ethan felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't realized was tight. He almost laughed. I'll tell him you said so. Don't you dare, she said. But there was something in the corner of her voice that wasn't quite suppressed. It was the closest they'd come to laughing together. He thought about it later, washing up before supper, and recognized the feeling it had left behind. Not happiness exactly, but something adjacent. Something he hadn't been paying attention to because he'd stopped expecting it. The letter from the bank arrived the second week of November. He'd known it was coming. The timing had been in the back of his mind since September, when the last payment had gone out, and the balance had looked exactly as discouraging as he'd expected. But seeing the envelope with the Billings National letterhead still produced a specific cold in his stomach that he associated with all the worst years since the Garrett business. He read it at the kitchen table while Clara was outside checking the south fence line. She'd decided it needed a third look after a section of wire had sagged overnight. The letter was formal and not unfriendly, which was almost worse than if it had been direct. Banks wrote letters the way undertakers dressed bodies, with a professional kindness that didn't disguise the underlying reality. Underlying reality was that Ethan owed more than he was currently able to cover at the terms agreed upon, and the bank would require either a modified repayment schedule or additional security within 60 days. 60 days was February. February was the worst possible time to be solving a financial problem on a Montana cattle ranch. He was still sitting at the table when Clara came back in, and she read his face before she'd fully gotten her coat off. She sat down across from him without being invited. Tell me. He pushed the letter across the table. She read it carefully, the way she read everything start to finish, no skimming. When she put it down, she didn't say anything immediately. How did it get this bad? She asked finally. He'd been dreading that question. Not because it was an accusation she hadn't said it like one, but because the answer required him to say out loud something he'd been carrying alone for 4 years. Business partnership, he said. Man named Garrett. We were buying a breeding bull together, splitting costs on some improvements to both our operations. Sharing equipment made sense on paper. What happened? He walked. Ethan looked at the letter on the table. took his share of the equipment back, claimed the bull was his contribution, and the improvement costs were mine to absorb. We didn't have it in writing the way we should have. I hired a lawyer in Billings, and the lawyer cost money, and in the end I got less back than the legal fees cost me. He paused. I had a bad winter that year on top of it. Lost 11 head. After that, I was playing from behind. And playing from behind when you're already stretched, you know how it goes. You never caught up. I kept the operation running. Paid the minimums. But catching up, he shook his head. No. Clara pulled the letter back toward her side of the table and read one section again. 60 days isn't enough time to do this the right way, she said. But it might be enough time to do it in a way that buys you another year. I've been thinking about selling the East 40. She was quiet for a moment. Is that the parcel that borders the Selby Creek drainage? Yes. That's your water access in a dry year. He knew that. He'd known it when he'd thought of it, and he'd thought of it anyway, because it was the most obvious piece to move. I know. Don't sell the water access, she said. It wasn't a command, her voice stayed level, but it had a quality of certainty to it that landed differently than advice. Not until you've tried everything else. What's everything else? She sat back slightly and looked at the middle distance the way she did when she was actually thinking rather than just responding. He'd learned this about her. She was slow to speak when the thing required thought, and she didn't fill the silence to make anyone comfortable, including herself. Breeding stock, she said finally. You have 3 cows that aren't producing adequately. I've been watching them for 2 weeks. You're carrying the feed cost of animals that aren't returning value. I know, but selling them now in winter, you won't get full price. Get something. She put her hand flat on the table, not gesturing, just grounding herself. You also have the roan gelding in the east paddock. He's a well-trained horse. What's he doing? He was Catherine's, Ethan said. The words came out before he decided to say them. Clara went still. Not uncomfortably, she just held very quiet for a moment. The way you do when someone says a name that's connected to something painful and you're deciding how to treat it. Your wife, she said. Yes. How long ago? 9 years. She nodded once. You don't have to sell the horse, she said. But if you're going to keep him because you want to, not because you haven't decided yet. It wasn't unkind. But it was accurate in a way that hit something he'd been avoiding. And he had to look away for a moment at the wall. I haven't decided yet, he admitted. Then you have time. She pulled the letter back in front of her. Let me go through what you're spending on supplies and what we might reduce. I want to see the full picture before we talk about what to sell. He looked at her. Why? She met his eyes. Because you came into this alone, and you don't have to be. He'd asked her to help save his ranch. He hadn't expected that the hardest part of accepting that help would be allowing himself to believe it was actually offered. He went and got the ledger. They sat at the table for 2 hours that evening, going through it together. Clara asked questions with the focused precision of someone who'd kept her own books for years and knew which numbers mattered and which were noise. She caught 3 places where he was over-ordering a supply that had a cheaper equivalent, and 2 places where a small change in the feeding schedule would reduce waste over a month's time to something meaningful. None of it was transformative. Together, it added up. You're not as far behind as the bank thinks, she said finally, comparing something on the page to the letter's figures. The way they've calculated the outstanding balance, they're using a valuation on the cattle that's 18 months old. If you get a current appraisal, the asset picture looks different. You know how to read a bank's valuation methodology? My husband left debt when he died, she said simply. I learned what I had to learn. He looked at her across the table, the lamplight on her face, the bank letter between them, the ledger open to a page he'd been avoiding for 3 months, and felt something shift in his understanding of what had brought her here. It wasn't simple. It wasn't the story the town told about an old woman with nowhere to go. It was a woman who'd spent 12 years solving problems that most people assumed she couldn't handle, and who'd gotten good at it, and who was now sitting across from him and doing it again because she'd decided to. Clara, he said. She looked up. I'm glad you're here. He said it before he could talk himself out of saying it. I want you to know that. I don't care what the town says about it. She held his gaze for a moment. Her expression didn't change dramatically. She wasn't a person of dramatic expressions, but something in it settled, like a door finding its frame. I know, she said, and she turned back to the ledger. Dale Pruitt came back 3 days later, not to the ranch this time, but to Granger's store, where he knew Ethan had a standing Tuesday errand for supplies. He was waiting when Ethan arrived, positioned at the counter with the practiced casualness of someone who'd planned to be exactly where they were. Ethan. Dale turned with the easy confidence of a man who'd convinced himself the previous conversation hadn't gone the way it had. I heard you've got some financial trouble. Don't know where you heard that. Ethan set his list on the counter for Granger, who was already very interested in the labels on a shelf behind him. Small town. Dale shrugged. Look, I'll get to it. The East 40 if you're thinking about moving it. I'd like first offer. I'll give you a fair price, and we can have the deal done before the bank letter turns into something more serious. Ethan looked at him. You know about the bank letter. Word gets around. Word doesn't just get around about something that specific. Ethan kept his voice even. Who told you? Dale had the grace to look briefly uncomfortable. Doesn't matter. The offer stands. No, it doesn't. Ethan picked up his list off the counter and looked at Granger. I'll take the usual. I'll come back for it in an hour. He looked at Dale one more time. Don't come to the ranch again. He walked out. He sat in the wagon for 10 minutes before driving back because he needed to think and because he didn't trust himself to be inside a building with Dale Pruitt for the next while. The East 40, the water access parcel, piece of land that mattered most to the ranch's long-term viability. And the piece that Dale, who ran the largest feed operation in the county and had been quietly acquiring surrounding parcels for 6 years, would pay anything to have. Dale knew about the bank letter. That meant Dale had a contact at the bank, or someone who had overheard something, or more likely had engineered a situation where information that was supposed to be private wasn't. He drove back to the ranch with the supplies and found Clara in the barn, working on the hay storage arrangement she'd been reorganizing. She'd determined that the way it was stacked was wasting 20% of the available space and creating moisture pockets that would damage the lower bales by January. She looked up when he came in. What happened? She said. Dale Pruitt offered to buy the East 40. She straightened up slowly. He knew you were considering it. He knew about the bank letter. Clara set down the baling hook she'd been using. She looked at the hay for a moment, then back at him. He wants the water access, she said. Not a question. I think that's been the plan for a while. Ethan set down the supply crates. He's been buying land on the east side of the county for years. My parcel is a piece he needs to complete something. Then the bank letter might not be coincidence, she said quietly. He'd been thinking the same thing and hadn't wanted to say it. Can't prove that. No, but it changes what we need to do. She picked the baling hook back up, then set it down again. We need to make this ranch viable enough, fast enough, that you don't need to sell any of it, especially that parcel. 60 days isn't enough time to turn a struggling cattle operation into a profitable one. No, but it might be enough time to demonstrate a credible path forward to the bank and buy another season. She looked at him with the steady, unhurried focus that he'd come to understand was the most reliable thing about her. I've been thinking about the spring calving. You have 3 bred heifers that should drop in March. Good stock. If we can show projected income from the spring calf crop alongside the operating reductions we identified, the bank's risk picture changes. You think they'll renegotiate? Banks don't want your land. They want to be paid. Give them a reason to believe they'll be paid, and most of them will take the longer path. She paused. Your bank loan officer, what's he like? Methodical. Fair, I think. I've dealt with worse. Then it's worth going to Billings and making the case directly before the 60 days are up. She picked the baling hook back up. We have time to prepare that case properly. We. He noticed the word. She used it without fanfare, the way you use a tool that's simply the right one for the job. He nodded. All right, She turned back to the hay. He started unloading the supply crates. The barn was cold and smelled of old wood and cattle and the particular dusty sweetness of dry hay, and outside the wind was getting a harder edge to it. He worked alongside her for a while without speaking, passing bales as she arranged them, and the rhythm of it was something he recognized. Now the particular efficiency of two people who'd learned each other's movements without having to discuss them. She knew which side he'd approach from. He knew to leave clearance on the left where she moved. Small things. They added up. At some point, Molly, a sorrel mare, pushed her nose over her stall partition and exhaled loudly, the way horses do when they want acknowledgement. Clara reached out without looking and scratched behind the mare's ear, still counting bales. Molly leaned into it. Ethan watched that and felt something he couldn't quite name, not sentiment exactly, just an awareness of how differently the barn felt now than it had a month ago. Less like a place where one man worked alone and more like a place where work happened between people. He was thinking about the East 40 and the bank, and Dale Pruitt, and what Clara had said about the bank not wanting his land when she spoke again without stopping her work. "He won't stop," she said. "Dale, people who want something specific don't stop because you say no once." She moved a bale with the efficiency that still caught him off guard sometimes, the clean use of her whole body rather than just her arms. Find another way to pressure you. The bank letter was one angle. He'll find others. I know. Ethan had known it in the wagon, staring at the road back. I've been thinking about what those angles might be. So have I. She stopped and looked at him across the hay. Your neighbor to the north, the Selby family. Do you have a good relationship with them? Decent. Old Thomas Selby and I have traded work a few times. His son Reuben is less friendly, but he's fair. They share your water drainage. If someone were to complicate your water rights, it would affect them too. She tilted her head slightly. Worth telling them what's happening before Dale does. He thought about that. It was smart a flank he hadn't considered, because he'd been thinking about the problem straight ahead rather than from the sides. You think he'd go after the water rights separately? If he can't buy the land, he might try to make the land less valuable. She said it without drama, as if she were discussing fence posts. That's how men like Dale Pruitt operate. They find the piece that matters, and they push on it. You've dealt with men like him before. The man who bought the eastern edge of my Nebraska farm when I was struggling, the year before the water table dropped, had an offer in to my banker before I'd finished reading the first letter. She met his eyes. I sold him 40 acres at a price I later learned was a third below market. I didn't know then what I know now. He held her gaze. What do you know now? That the offer always comes at exactly the moment when you feel most desperate. That's not coincidence. That's timing. She picked up another bale. Don't sell anything to a man who's been waiting for you to be desperate. Whatever he's offering, it's less than it's worth. He stood in the cold barn listening to the wind outside and thought she came here with a trunk full of tools and 12 years of hard-won knowledge that nobody in this town had thought to ask about. And Dale Pruitt had written a letter to stop her from arriving. Picked up his side of the next bale. Talk to the Selbys tomorrow, he said. Yes, she agreed. And get that current cattle appraisal started. I'll help you write up the case for the bank before the end of the week. The wind found a gap somewhere in the barn, siding, and moved through in a low whistle. The horses shifted in their stalls. The hay was stacked square and tight against the back wall. Better than it had been. Better than it was going to need to be. Neither of them said anything for a while. The work was enough, and the quiet between them had become the comfortable kind, not empty, just settled. Kind that takes time to build and means something when it's there. Outside, Red Hollow was going about its business, forming its opinions, carrying its small certainties about who was useful and who was past their time. Inside the barn, a woman who'd already been underestimated, once today stacked hay with the precision of someone who understood that survival is made of 1,000 small, correct decisions, and a man who'd spent 4 years making do was beginning to understand, slowly, what building actually required. It required someone who'd done it before. It required not making the same mistake twice. It required knowing, when a man was waiting for your worst moment to make his best offer, that the answer was going to be no, and that the answer could stay no, as long as you had enough people standing on the right side of the fence line when the hard weather finally came. The hard weather was coming. Both of them could feel it in the air, not just the cold of the approaching season, but something larger and less forgiving gathering on the horizon. The way serious trouble always announces itself just slightly too late for the unprepared. Ethan Caldwell had spent 4 years being unprepared. He was starting to believe he might not be, this time. The trip to Billings took 3 days. Ethan had made the journey alone a dozen times over the years. The long road, south through frozen rangeland, the night stop at the Harmon Roadhouse, the particular exhaustion of arriving in a city after days of empty country. He'd always found the bank meetings draining in a specific way that had less to do with the numbers and more to do with sitting across from men who spoke a language of figures and projections that he understood imperfectly, and they knew it. This time was different. Clara sat beside him on the wagon seat for the first full day of travel, a leather satchel on her lap containing the case they'd built together over 5 evenings at the kitchen table. She'd organized it with the same systematic thoroughness she brought to everything current cattle. Appraisal from Hendricks, the livestock assessor, which had come in 12% above the bank's 18-month-old figure, 3-year operating cost comparison, showing the reductions already implemented, projected income from the spring calf crop. With conservative estimates, she'd insisted on keeping below what either of them actually expected, and a 1-page summary that stated their position in plain language, without apology or excessive qualification. She'd written the summary herself. He'd read it twice and changed 2 words and left the rest exactly as she'd written it. "You've done this before," he said, somewhere on the 2nd hour of road. Not just kept books, actually argued with a bank. Twice. She kept her eyes on the road ahead. Once after Samuel died, when they wanted to accelerate the repayment on the farm note. Once when the drought hit and I needed an extension on the equipment loan. She paused. I won the first one. I lost the second. What made the difference? Considered that. The first time, I had numbers that were stronger than their concern. The second time, I had numbers that were weaker, and I knew it, and they knew I knew it. She looked sideways at him, briefly. This time the numbers are real. They're not optimistic. They're defensible. That matters more than people think. He had been operating under a private fear, which he hadn't said to her, because it was the kind of fear that felt foolish to name, that the meeting would go badly, and he would have to come home and tell her that the East 40 was going to have to go after all, that Dale Pruitt was going to get what he'd been angling for, that the months of work and the reorganized barn and the repaired fence and the careful ledger review would turn out to be insufficient against the simple arithmetic of what he owed. He hadn't said any of that, but she'd made the conservative estimates in the projection without him asking her to, and he suspected she understood. The meeting with the loan officer, a careful, methodical man named Aldous Brigg, who wore the same gray suit every time Ethan had ever seen him, and who had the disconcerting habit of reading documents while you were still explaining them, lasted just under 2 hours. Clara sat to Ethan's left and let him lead, but when Brigg's questions moved into territory where she had better answers, she answered, without deferring to Ethan first, and Ethan didn't flinch when she did. Brigg had looked at her when she first spoke, a brief recalibrating look, and then he'd looked at the document she'd produced. And after that, he'd addressed his questions to whichever of them was more likely to know the answer. By the end of it, they had a modified schedule. 18 additional months, increased interest but manageable, with a progress review at the 1-year mark. East 40 stayed. Ethan shook Brigg's hand. Clara gathered the documents back into the satchel with the economy of movement that he'd stopped noticing as unusual, because it was simply how she did things. In the hallway outside the bank, she stopped and stood very still for a moment. "All right?" he said. "Yes." She let out a breath that was controlled enough to tell him it had been an effort to keep it controlled. I wasn't certain until he said the year review. The first 18 months with no review would have been better, but the year review is manageable. You didn't look uncertain. No. She adjusted the satchel on her arm and started toward the door. I've learned not to. On the road home, she slept for several hours on the second day, sitting upright on the wagon seat, with her head tilted back and her arms folded against the cold. He'd offered her the bedroll to lean against, and she'd declined. And then 20 minutes later, she was asleep anyway. And the pragmatic stubbornness of that was so characteristic that he found himself almost smiling at the road. He let her sleep and drove, and thought about the year ahead, and felt something unfamiliar and not entirely comfortable, something that required him to consider the future rather than just the immediate problem, which was itself a change. They came home to a broken water trough, not the covered one. Clara had rigged the large primary trough in the center pasture, which had been in marginal condition for 2 seasons and had finally given out completely at the seam, flooding the surrounding ground and leaving 38 cattle without reliable water access in temperatures that hovered near single digits. It was Frank Delacroix who'd found it. He'd come over to return a borrowed auger and noticed the wet ground steaming in the cold and the cattle clustered at the fence line, looking confused and unhappy, and he'd done what he could with his own tools, which was mostly to confirm that the trough was done and to leave a note on the kitchen door. They arrived home to the note and the ruined trough as the light was failing. Ethan read the note and felt the specific sinking feeling of a problem that couldn't wait until morning. Cattle could manage 1 night, maybe, in these temperatures with the creek access on the east side, but the creek would be iced over and they'd need to break it. And he didn't have enough hours of daylight left to both break ice and deal with the trough. Creek first, Clara said, reading over his shoulder. They need water tonight. The trough is tomorrow's problem. The trough is $100 problem, he said, which was money they'd just committed to different purposes. The trough is a fixable problem. She'd already handed him the note back and was moving toward the barn to get the ice-breaking tools. Get the lantern. We'll need it before we're done. They spent 2 hours at the creek in the dark, taking turns with the heavy bar to break through 8 inches of ice at 3 access points, then driving the cattle in relays to drink. It was the kind of work that was purely physical and left no room for thought, just the weight of the bar, the resistance of the ice, the steam of breath in lantern light, particular sounds cattle make when they finally reach water they've needed for hours. Somewhere in the second hour, Frank Delacroix appeared with his own lantern. He didn't announce himself. He just walked up, took the ice bar from Clara, when she paused to stretch her back, and went to work on the 3rd access point without a word. She looked at him for a moment, then picked up the driving switch to move the next group of cattle down. They finished the last of it around 9 in the evening. Frank declined supper with a brevity that suggested he had somewhere to be, but also that he'd wanted to help and was embarrassed about showing it. He was gone before Ethan could properly thank him. In the kitchen, warming up with coffee that Clara had started, the moment they came inside because she'd thought ahead to it, Ethan's sat at the table and felt the day's weight settling into his shoulders. Frank didn't have to come, he said. No. Clara wrapped both hands around her cup, but he did. I think he misjudged what you were when you arrived. Most people did. She said it without bitterness. He's been adjusting. Is that enough? For you? She looked at him across the table, with the steady, slightly measuring expression he'd learned, meant she was deciding how honest to be. It's more than most people manage, she said. Most people don't adjust at all. They just keep the opinion they started with and look for evidence to support it. She drank her coffee. Frank's a fair man who made an unfair first assessment. Forgivable. He thought about what wasn't forgivable, and his mind went, as it had repeatedly over the past weeks, to Dale Pruitt. Not with hot anger anymore. The hot anger had cooled into something more settled and more watchful. The trough, Clara said, bringing him back. Cast iron repair or replacement? He'd been thinking about it in the back of his mind since they'd read the note. Replacement. The seam that failed, it's not the only weak point. prepare it, and we're just waiting for the next one. Agreed. Where do you source? Hardware Man in Red Hollow has a catalog, usually a 6-week wait for large equipment. 6 weeks takes us to January. She set her cup down. Too long. We need another option. Milner's ranch sold off some equipment last spring. He might have a trough still. I can ask. Do that tomorrow. She was quiet for a moment. I want to look at the cattle again in the morning. 2 of the ones we brought to the creek tonight were moving slow, the others mine. Could be the cold, could be something else. The gray heifer? She looked at him slightly differently. You noticed. She's been off for about 4 days. I kept thinking it was the weather. It might be. It might not be. She stood and took her cup to the basin. I'll look at her properly in the morning. I've seen that particular slowness before. Sometimes it's a respiratory start. Sometimes it's something in the gut. We need to know which. He watched her rinse her cup and thought about the Nebraska farm she'd kept running for 8 years through drought and isolation and debt and whatever other ordinary catastrophes a working farm produced. He thought about how she'd described her father, handing her harder things to do as his version of approval. He thought about the patient, careful way she moved through problems, as if she'd long ago made peace with the fact that problems were simply the texture of life and hysteria didn't solve them. You weren't supposed to be doing this, he said. She turned around. Doing what? All of it. The bank case, the trough, the cattle. You were supposed to, he stopped, because finishing the sentence meant saying out loud what the town had imagined, and he'd only half imagined himself. You were supposed to cook and keep house and be grateful for the arrangement. Clara looked at him for a long moment. I know what I was supposed to be, she said. I didn't come here to be that. No, I know. He met her eyes. I'm glad you didn't. She turned off the lamp over the basin and moved toward the stairs. The bottom step she paused. The gray heifer her name? I don't name them. Why not? He thought about it. Seemed easier not to. She looked at him with an expression that held something she'd decided not to say, and then she said it anyway. Things don't hurt less because you don't name them. They just die unnamed. She went upstairs. He sat at the table for a while after, listening to the house settle in the cold, and thought about a horse named Molly, and 11 cattle he'd lost in a hard year, and a wife named Catherine, who died in August, and a ranch he'd been letting fail by degrees, while he told himself he was only maintaining it. He thought about what Clara had said about things dying unnamed. In the morning, she was in the barn before him. He found her crouched beside the gray heifer in the corner stall, her hand along the animal's flank, her head tilted in concentration. The heifer was standing but dull-eyed, her breathing slightly elevated. Respiratory, Clara said without looking up. Early stage, she needs separating and warmth. She stood pressing one hand briefly to her lower back, the reflexive gesture of someone who'd been crouched too long and whose back had opinions about it. Do you have camphor? Medicine box. Shelf in the tack room. She nodded and moved toward the tack room, and he began making up a separate stall for the heifer with extra bedding, working automatically through the familiar motions while his mind ran the calculation. The heifer went to a respiratory infection, they'd lose her, and potentially whatever calf she was carrying if she'd taken. That was a real number. That was part of the spring projection they'd just put in front of Aldous Brigg. Clara came back with the camphor and mixed a treatment with the focused efficiency of someone who'd done it before. He held the heifer while she administered it, and the heifer objected in the tired, half-hearted way of an animal that didn't feel well enough to put real effort into protest. She'll need watching for 3 days, Clara said, wiping her hands. The fever comes up significantly. We'll need the doctor. Hendricks makes animal calls. Expensive, but he's good. Let's see how she responds first. Clara looked at the heifer with an appraising expression. She's strong enough. I think she'll come through. She paused. Name her something. He looked at the heifer gray-brown, white patch above the left eye, ears slightly too large for her head. Iris, he said, which was the first thing that came to him. Clara looked at him sideways with an expression that might have been approval. Good. She picked up her work gloves. Now let's find out about Milner's trough. The word about the Milner trough came back favorable. Old Thomas Milner had one he'd pull from his shed for a fair price. And Ethan drove out that afternoon and came back with it, loaded in the wagon. Clara had already cleared the site where the old one had failed and dug out the frozen ground enough to get a proper level base. He didn't ask how she'd moved that much frozen soil alone. He just unhitched the wagon, and they set the new trough together, leveling it twice to get it right, connecting the inlet pipe while the temperature dropped around them, and the daylight ran short. It wasn't elegant work. The ground was wrong, and the pipe connection took 3 attempts, and Clara scraped her knuckles badly on the second attempt and said a word he hadn't heard her say before, which suggested she had a fuller vocabulary than she generally deployed. He offered her his handkerchief, and she took it and wrapped her knuckles and kept working. By the time they had water running, it was full dark, and they were both cold in the specific bone-deep way that comes from hours of outdoor work in winter temperatures. That night, for the first time, they sat by the stove together, rather than going immediately about their separate evening routines. It wasn't planned. Clara had sat down to look at her knuckles under better light, and hadn't gotten back up, and he'd poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her, and sat down himself, and somehow neither of them had moved after that. The stove ticked and breathed. Outside the wind was light but steady. "Tell me about your husband," Ethan said. He hadn't planned to say it either. The evening seemed to have loosened something in the usual careful management of what they said and didn't say to each other. Clara looked at her wrapped knuckles. "Samuel." She said the name the way you say the name of someone who's been gone a long time, like a word in a language you still speak, but don't hear enough anymore. He was a quiet man, not cold, just interior. He kept most of himself in a place you had to earn your way into. Did you earn your way in? Eventually. A small pause. Took about 4 years. Then it took another 2 years for me to understand what I'd gotten there. Was it worth it? She considered that with real seriousness, not as a rhetorical question. Yes. But I won't pretend it wasn't sometimes very hard to be married to someone who found it difficult to let people be close. She looked at the stove. He was a better farmer than most people gave him credit for. Methodical. He didn't waste things. He had a way with animals they trusted him, even ones that didn't trust people. She paused again. When he died, I thought the hardest part would be the grief. But the hardest part was actually the silence. We'd been living with his particular kind of quiet for so long that I thought I was used to quiet, but his kind was full. There were things in it. She stopped. "And after?" Ethan said carefully. "After was just empty." She picked up her coffee. "For about 2 years. And then she looked at him. Then I got up in the morning, and there was work to do." He turned his cup slowly in his hands. "I know something about that. I imagine you do." "Catherine," we stopped and started again. She was a person who made rooms feel occupied. You walked into a room she was in, and you knew someone was there before you saw them. After she was gone, I kept thinking there was. I kept expecting to hear her somewhere in the house. He looked at the floor. It was 3 years before that stopped. Clara was quiet for a moment. "Does it still hurt sometimes?" "Less than it used to. Differently than it used to." He looked up. "You don't..." He was trying to figure out how to say something that he hadn't tried to say before. "You don't replace it. The grief. You don't get rid of it. There's more room over time." Yes. She said it with the weight of someone who knew that was true. That's exactly right. They sat with that for a while. Then she said, "Ethan, about Dale Pruitt." The name settled between them like a stone dropped in water. "What about him?" "He came by the ranch while you were at Milner's this afternoon." He looked at her. She'd said it straightforwardly, not bracing for a reaction, just stating a fact and letting him have his response to it. "He came to the house?" His voice was carefully level. "He came to the yard. He didn't come to the door." She set her cup down. He stood at the gate post for about 10 minutes, looking at the barn and the pastures. "He didn't know I was watching." "What was he doing?" "I think he was counting." She met Ethan's eyes. The cattle, the new trough, the wood stock. He was taking an inventory. The implication sat there clearly. "He's calculating what we have," Ethan said. and whether we're stronger than he thought. Clara folded her hands on the table. When he left, he drove toward Granger's, not toward his feed store. Granger's is where people go to talk. Yes, Ethan sat back and thought about what it meant. Dale Pruitt, counting cattle and noting the new trough, and heading to Granger's. It meant Dale was reassessing. Reassessing meant he was still working an angle, just adjusting the calculation. He's going to do something through the water rights, Ethan said, thinking aloud. The move I haven't figured out yet. I've been thinking about that. Clara turned her coffee cup without drinking from it, a habit he'd noticed she had when she was working through something in her mind. Your water access on the east parcel runs through a drainage that originates on old Carver land. Who owns the Carver parcel now, he thought. It sold 2 years ago. I don't know who bought it. She looked at him. He felt a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. Do you think Dale owns the Carver parcel? I think it would be worth finding out. He got the land register from the county office the next morning. The Carver parcel had transferred 22 months ago to a company called Holloway Land Holdings, registered in Billings. He'd never heard of Holloway Land Holdings. Neither had Frank Delacroix. Neither had old Thomas Selby, who knew the county's land transactions the way some people know, whether deeply and informally, and without needing to consult documents. Thomas Selby had squinted at the company name and scratched his jaw and said he'd heard of a Holloway something or other in connection with the Pruitt feed operations expansion east, but he couldn't swear to it. Clara was in the yard when Ethan came back from the Selby place, replacing a section of wagon traces that had been on his repair list for 3 weeks. She looked up when he rode in. Holloway Land Holdings, he said, dismounting. Put down the trace. In connection with Pruitt? Thomas Selby thinks so. Can't prove it. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the trace in her hands. If he controls the upstream drainage, he can argue for priority water rights in a dry year. Or he can cause problems with the drainage itself, debris, redirected flow, and then point to natural causes. That's a complicated scheme for a man who runs a feed store. He's been buying land for 6 years, Clara said. That's not a feed store man thinking. That's a man with a plan that takes years. She set the trace down properly and looked at him. He's been building towards something specific. Your parcel and probably the Selby water share are the last pieces. Ethan stood in the yard in the cold and felt the size of it settling on him. Not panic, he'd moved past the kind of panic that used to visit him when things got complicated, but a sober, clear-eyed recognition of what they were actually up against. I need a lawyer, he said. Yes, but not the one in Billings you used before. Why not? Because that lawyer didn't read the contract with Garrett carefully enough to protect you. She said it without apology for the directness of it. You need someone better. Someone who understands water rights specifically. There's a man in Helena, James Morrison. He handled the water dispute between the Reardon Ranch and the County Irrigation Board 4 years back. The Reardons won. Can you reach him?
I can.
Don't know if he'll come out for something this size. Write and find out. She picked up the trace again. And in the meantime, I want to document everything. Carver parcel transfer date. Every interaction with Pruitt. The bank letter timing. She looked at him steadily. If this goes to a legal question, the documentation will matter more than anything else. He looked at her, this woman who'd arrived 6 weeks ago with one trunk and gray hair and weathered hands, and a lifetime of doing things the world had, decided she was too old to do anymore, who'd come into his failing ranch and reorganized the barn and repaired the porch and fixed the fence and built a case for the bank and treated a sick heifer and installed a trough and now was standing in his yard tracing the outline of something that might turn into a real legal fight, and doing it with the same unruffled, focused attention she brought to everything. He thought about what Dale Pruitt had written in his letter to the agency. No self-respecting rancher in this territory wants what's left of a woman like that. What was left of her, he thought. There is more left of her than he will ever understand. I'll write Morrison tonight, Ethan said. Good. She went back to the trace. He went inside and wrote the letter, careful with the details. laying out the situation plainly the way Clara had taught him. A bank presentation should go numbers real, assessment conservative, ask specific. He sealed it and set it by the door to go out with tomorrow's post rider. Then he went back to the kitchen and found that Clara had, at some point in the interval, come inside and started supper, the beans and the remnants of the salted beef from 2 days ago, the dried herbs she'd found in the back of his pantry, and apparently decided to put to actual use. The smell of it reached him in the doorway. He stood there for a moment in the warmth of the kitchen, the sealed letter in his hand, and let himself have something he'd been resisting for weeks. A feeling that was not tentative, not careful, not hedged against disappointment. He set the letter by the door and sat down at the table. "We got the Morrison letter sorted," he said. "Good." She didn't turn from the stove. "Clara." He stopped. There was something he wanted to say that he didn't yet have the exact right words for. "The work you've done here, for this ranch, since you arrived." He paused. "I want you to know I see it, all of it." She was still for a moment at the stove. Then she turned around and looked at him. "I know," she said, and there was something in the way she said it quietly, without deflection, accepting it as simple truth and rather than compliment that told him she'd been waiting for it without having admitted to herself that she was waiting. "Good," he said. She turned back to the stove. He sat at the table and looked at the east-facing window, where the last of the daylight was going from gray to dark, and thought about spring, calves, the Morrison letter, the documentation Clara wanted to compile, the gray heifer named Iris who was, as of this morning, standing brighter-eyed and eating again, which Clara had announced at breakfast with a brevity that didn't hide how relieved she was. It was December now. The winter was only getting started. And, somewhere in the territory, Dale Pruitt was sitting in a room doing his own calculations, adjusting his approach, looking for the angle that would finally work. But the angle he'd chosen for a woman he'd tried to stop before she arrived had not worked. The angle he'd chosen through the bank had not worked. East 40 was still Ethan's. The water access was still Ethan's. And for the first time since the Garrett business, Ethan Caldwell did not feel like a man who was waiting to find out how much more he was going to lose. Kitchen was warm. The stove breathed steadily. Outside, the first real snow of December was beginning to fall, not the warning flurries of November, but the serious, committed snow that meant the winter was settling in for the long run. Clara watched it through the window as she served supper. "It's going to be a hard one," she said. Not afraid of it, just noting it. "Yes," Ethan said. She set the plates down and sat across from him. And outside the window the snow fell heavier and heavier, the way it does in Montana when it means business, the way the worst winters announce themselves not gently, not gradually, but all at once, with a kind of absolute certainty that this is what is happening now, that there is no negotiating with the seasons, that the only question that matters is whether you. What neither of them could know, yet what no one in Red Hollow could know, that the snow fallen outside the window on that December evening was the beginning of the worst blizzard in 30 years. That by morning, the road to town would be buried. That the temperature would drop to places that turned breath to ice before it left your mouth. And that somewhere in the frozen dark of the barn, a mare who had been Ethan's best breeding animal for 6 years would begin the most dangerous night of her life. What neither of them could know was that the next 72 hours would change every calculation anyone in Red Hollow had made about Clara Whitmore. But the snow knew. The snow was already falling with the particular weight and purpose of something that has decided, finally, to be serious. And inside the warm kitchen, 2 people ate supper together in the comfortable quiet of people who have stopped being strangers and are not yet sure what name to give what they have become instead, while outside the world prepared itself to test them in the way that only real hardship cannot by asking what you think you can do, but by showing you, without permission, exactly what you are made of. The snow that had begun falling on that December evening did not stop. By midnight it was coming down in the thick, purposeful way that experienced ranchers recognized as something beyond ordinary winter, not a storm that would blow through in a day and leave the world bright and manageable on the other side, but the kind that settled in and meant to stay. Ethan woke at 2 in the morning to a sound he couldn't immediately identify, something between a groan and a crack, and lay still for a moment before understanding it was the weight of snow on the barn roof, shifting. He was dressed and pulling on his coat before he'd finished the thought. Clara's door was already open. He passed it in the dark hallway and found the kitchen empty, the stove banked low and the back door slightly ajar. She was already outside. He found her at the barn door with a lantern, clearing the accumulated drift that had built against it. She'd been awake, he didn't know for how long, and she'd come out and started on the problem without waking him. "How long?" he said, taking the shovel from her by unspoken agreement. "An hour, maybe." She held the lantern higher. "The roof is holding, but that drift was blocking the door from swinging clear. If we needed to get in fast, I know." He worked at the drift. The cold was extraordinary, the kind that made the inside of your nose feel like paper and turned the moisture in your eyes into something that stung. "How are the animals?" "I looked through the gap before I started shoveling. The horses are restless but standing." I couldn't see Iris clearly. He got the door open enough to pass through. The barn air was cold, but not the open sky cold of outside. It held the body warmth of the animals in it. A slight softening of the temperature that was its own kind of relief. The horses moved in their stalls. Molly, the sorrel mare, was at the back of her stall, and when Ethan raised the lantern, he could see immediately that something was wrong. She was down, not standing against the back wall, the way horses stand. When they're uneasy, she was down on her side in the straw, and she was breathing in a way that was labored and wrong. And when he stepped closer, he saw the sweat dark on her flank despite the cold. "She's in labor," Clara said from beside him. Her voice was steady but quick. "How far along is she?" 3 weeks early. He was already moving into the stall, crouching beside Molly. The mare's eye found him large and dark and afraid, in the way that horses are afraid, without the capacity to understand what their body was doing to them. Put his hand on her neck. She was shaking. Has she foaled before? Clara set the lantern on the stall hook. Once, 2 years ago. It went normally. He ran his hand along her flank, trying to feel the position of the foal. "Clara, this shouldn't be happening yet. If the foal isn't turned right, I know." She was already kneeling in the straw beside him, her coat open, going to Molly's belly, with a confidence that made him move sideways to give her room without questioning it. "I've done this twice. Both came out right." She pressed with careful, deliberate pressure, reading through the wall of the mare's belly, positioned. It's not a bad presentation, but she's tired already. "How long has she been like this?" "I don't know. I woke up an hour ago." If she's been in labor more than 2 hours without progress, the foal could be in trouble. Clara looked at him directly. "We can't get to town." No, he'd already done that calculation. The road would be impassable. Even if he could get a horse out through the drifts, by the time he reached Hendrick's place and got back it would be morning, and whatever was going to happen would have happened. "It's on us." She nodded once. "Then I need your hands, and I need you to do exactly what I tell you." For the next 3 hours, the blizzard conducted its business outside the barn walls. While inside, Ethan Caldwell and Clara Whitmore worked to save a life that hadn't yet fully entered the world. Clara directed. He understood. Somewhere in the first 20 minutes, that whatever farming experience she'd drawn on to develop this knowledge had been purchased through hard situations. She wasn't reading from memory. She was operating from actual body knowledge, with kind that lives in the hands and the reflexes rather than in the head. She knew when to push and when to wait. She knew when Molly needed encouragement, voice, and touch, the low, steady talking that she kept up throughout, not sentimental, just present, and when the mare needed to be held still for her own safety. His hands did what she said. There were moments when what she said was counterintuitive, and he did it anyway, because in those moments, her certainty was more reliable than his instincts. Molly labored with the terrible patience of an animal that has no choice. She tried twice to stand, and Clara stopped her both times, a hand firm on her shoulder, speaking to her in that low, even voice. The lantern threw long shadows on the stall walls. Outside, the wind hit the barn in intervals that made the structure flex slightly, a sound like the whole building drawing a difficult breath. Close, Clara said. Around what Ethan guessed was the 2-hour mark, though time had ceased to operate normally. When it comes, I need you ready to clear the sack if she doesn't. Sometimes they don't, and you have about 2 minutes. I know. He'd attended enough calvings to understand that part. Foal's going to be cold. We need to get it breathing and keep it moving. Rub harder than you think you should. She didn't take her eyes off the mare. Don't let it lie still, Clara. He said her name and waited until she looked at him briefly. Got this. She looked at him for 1 second with an expression that was not the composed, measured face she usually showed the world, but something less managed, tired and focused, and carrying the weight of knowing that outcome wasn't fully in anyone's hands. Then she looked back at the mare. We've got this, she said. The foal came in a rush of motion that Ethan would remember for years in fragments, rather than as a continuous event, the mare's final effort, a sudden release, Clara's hands sure and immediate, his own, reaching in without hesitation to clear the membrane from the foal's nose and mouth, while Clara worked from the other side. Cold hit the wet foal like a wall, and it startled, which was good, a good sign. And Clara was already saying, rub, keep it moving, and he did, both hands working along the foal's ribs and neck with firm, deliberate pressure. Foal shook its head. It was a colt, dark bay, almost black in the lantern light, with his mother's white snip on his nose. He was undersized from the early arrival, legs disproportionate in the way of new foals, but he was breathing. He was breathing and shaking, and making the small, confused sounds that meant he was trying to understand what had just happened to him, which was the most important thing in the world at that moment. Molly raised her head. Clara sat back on her heels in the straw and let out a breath that she'd been holding for what must have been a long time. She was covered in straw and worse. Her hands were shaking not from cold, or not only from cold, the fine tremor of someone whose body had been running on focused tension and was now beginning to release it. She'd scraped the knuckles on her right hand again, the same one she'd hurt on the trough, and there was blood from it on the straw beside her that she hadn't acknowledged. Ethan was still rubbing the colt's neck and sides, firm and slow. He looked over at her. Clara. She looked back at him. Her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the cold, and she pressed her lips together once and looked away at the wall. He's breathing, she said. Her voice was almost its normal register. Because of you. She shook her head slightly, the way she always did when she was deflecting credit. He let her. Some things didn't need to be argued in the moment. Molly got her head around to the colt and began the rough, thorough work of cleaning him, and Clara watched the mare with the focused attention of someone not yet willing to declare anything finished. She'd told him once, or not. Told him more let slip that, with the Nebraska cattle, she'd learned that the first hour after a birth was as important as the birth itself. She stayed for that hour. He stayed too. By the time the colt was attempting the uncertain, spectacular failure and retry of first standing, the storm outside had reached its full intensity. The barn groaned. The lantern swayed on its hook. But the animals were alive, and the straw was thick, and the two humans in the stall had moved from crouching to sitting against the back wall, shoulders almost touching, watching a new and improbable creature discover his own legs. We should go in, Clara said. Few more minutes. She didn't argue. A few more minutes became 20. When they finally went in, the house felt like a different world, warm and still, and smelling of the morning's coffee still faintly in the air. Clara went directly to the basin and washed her hands and forearms with the careful thoroughness of someone who'd learned that you don't skip that part, regardless of how tired you are. Her hands were still slightly unsteady. She didn't hide it, but she didn't comment on it. He built up the stove while she changed her coat in the hallway. He put water on. They sat at the kitchen table at some ungodly early morning hour, with tea neither of them really tasted, and outside the blizzard continued its comprehensive rearrangement of the landscape, and inside two people, who had spent 3 hours doing something difficult together, sat with the quiet that follows difficult things. "What will you call him?" Clara said eventually. He thought about it. "Storm seems too obvious, it does." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "You could let it come to you." "That's what you'd do?" "That's what I'd do." She looked at her hands, the dried blood on the knuckle, which she'd missed in the washing. She picked at it absently. "You should know what I did tonight in there. It's not always. I've lost them too. A foal. In Nebraska, 3rd year of the drought. The mare lived, but the foal didn't make it past the first morning. I did everything the same." He looked at her. "Why are you telling me that?" "Because I don't want you to think tonight was—" She paused, finding the word. "Inevitable. We got a good outcome. But it could have gone the other way, and I would have done the same things. I know, I want you to know." She met his eyes briefly. "I'm not invincible. Tonight turned out right. Not every night does." He thought about what it cost her to say that this woman who'd learned to operate without showing her working, who'd made a philosophy of presenting competence rather than doubt, because the world hadn't given her the luxury of being seen to doubt. She was telling him something she didn't tell many people, and he understood it as the trust it was. "Catherine lost a foal the 2nd year we were married," he said. "Cried for 2 days. She said it wasn't about the foal specifically. It was about all the things you work at and still lose. That's an honest way to put it. She was an honest person." Clara nodded. They sat with that. In the morning, which arrived gray and buried and windswept, the full scope of the blizzard became clear. 3 feet of snow in the low spots, more against anything that had given the wind a reason to build. The road to town was gone entirely, replaced by an undifferentiated field of white. The south fence had a section down where a drift had built against it, and the weight had finally overcome the wire. The woodpile was accessible, but only after 40 minutes of digging, and Frank Delacroix appeared at 9 in the morning, having come on foot from his own ranch half a mile over. Specific expression of a man who decided he had a responsibility and had gotten up and acted on it before he could argue himself out of it. "Thought you might need hands," he said, stomping snow from his boots in the yard. "South fence is down," Ethan said. Frank looked past him toward the barn. "Everything make it?" "Molly foaled early. She and the colt are all right." He paused. Clara brought the colt through. Frank's eyes moved to the house, though Clara wasn't visible. He looked back at Ethan with the expression of a man revising something fundamental. "Early foaling in that temperature," he said. "Yeah. How early?" 3 weeks. Frank was quiet for a moment. "She's had experience with that?" "Nebraska. 12 years of it." Frank nodded slowly. He didn't say anything else on the subject. The something that was being revised in him was visible in the set of his jaw. They spent the day on the fence, the two of them, in the way that men do emergency outdoor work after a bad storm grimly, economically, with fewer words than usual, because the cold took words, and spending them wastefully seemed wrong. Clara checked the cattle 3 times through the day, moving through the snow with the pragmatic gait of someone who'd walked through worse, and was not going to be melodramatic about this. She'd found a problem with one of the bred heifers, not Iris, who was doing well, but another one who'd been thrown hard against the fence. When the section went down and she'd gotten the animal into the barn and worked on the hip injury with what she had available, which was not a veterinarian's tools, but was better than nothing. By midday, the sky had cleared to a pale, exhausted blue. The snow was done. The temperature was brutally cold but static now, the air still and glittering. The specific beauty of the aftermath that felt almost cruel given what it had cost. Frank stayed for supper. Clara made it for 3, without being asked whether that was the plan. Afterward, Frank sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and looked at Clara the way people look at someone they've been wrong about and are trying to figure out how to say so without making it worse. "Heard you on the way into Red Hollow when you arrived," he said. "I was at Milner's station." Clara looked at him across the table. She didn't say anything. "I said things." He looked at his coffee cup. I was talking to Walt Briggs from the hardware store. I said Ethan had lost his mind and some other things that weren't. He stopped. They weren't fair. No, Clara said. I'm saying so. She held his gaze for a moment. Her expression was the measured, neither warm nor cold one she wore when she was deciding something. I know the difference between a man who misjudges and adjusts and a man who misjudges and doubles down, she said finally. I've met both. You're the first kind. Frank looked at Ethan, who gave him nothing this was between the two of them. Then he looked back at Clara. The foals, he said, 3 weeks early in that cold. That's not nothing. Not nothing, she agreed. I'll tell people what happened, not to make a story of it, just because they should know. Picked up her coffee cup. That's your choice. I'm not asking you to. No, Frank said. But I'm going to. He left shortly after, heading back to his own place on foot, through the snow-covered dark, and Ethan watched him go from the doorway and then came back into the kitchen. He means it, Ethan said. I know. Clara was already clearing the cups. Doesn't change anything that needed doing. No, but it might change how people talk. She set the cups in the basin. People will talk however they want. They always do. She turned around. What matters is whether the ranch is standing come spring, whether the calves drop healthy, whether the Morrison letter comes back with something we can use. She looked at him directly. That's what matters. He heard what she was saying, and he heard what she was not saying, which was that she didn't need the town's approval, had never needed it, and had done everything she'd done in the last 6 weeks, not for Red Hollow's opinion, but for the practical, concrete reality of the ranch and the 2 people living on it. But she was also wrong. Just slightly, the town's opinion did matter, not for her but for the ranch, for the legal fight coming with Dale Pruitt, for the kind of standing they'd need if this became something that played out in county records and courtrooms and local relationships. And Frank Delacroix telling people accurately what Clara Whitmore had done in a freezing barn in the worst blizzard in 30 years was not nothing. It was in fact exactly the kind of thing that changed the ground under a person's feet in a small community. The Morrison letter arrived with the postwriter 6 days after the blizzard, delayed by the road conditions but intact. James Morrison was a precise man who wrote in the way of someone who'd been trained to say exactly what he meant and had never relaxed that habit. He confirmed that he had reviewed Ethan's summary of the situation. With regard to the Carver parcel, the water drainage, and the Holloway Land Holdings registration, confirmed that the matter was worth further investigation. He asked for a retainer of $40 and a complete documentation of the water access history on the east parcel, and he stated that if Holloway Land Holdings proved to be connected to Pruitt in a way that could be established, there were several legal arguments regarding preemptive interference with established water rights that might apply. He would come to Red Hollow in February. Ethan read the letter at the kitchen table and handed it to Clara without comment. She read it and handed it back. $40, she said. I know. The 3 breeding cows we identified as underperforming, if we move them at the January market in Billings, we should clear close to that. He looked at her. You've been tracking Billings market prices. Granger gets the weekly report in with the Post. I've been reading it when I go in for supplies. She said it without apology. The January market is usually stronger than people expect because the fall sellers have cleared out and the spring buyers haven't started. If we get there in the first week, the road might not be clear in the first week. Then the second week, the price will still be reasonable. He thought about the $40 and the Morrison letter and the Holloway Land Holdings registration and Dale Pruitt standing at his gate in December, counting cattle, and the bank letter, and the 60 days that were now down to something manageable, and the foal in the barn who was going to need a name. He thought about all of it together, as a whole picture, which was something he'd stopped being able to do somewhere. In the years since Garrett, because looking at the whole picture had been too discouraging to sustain. The whole picture now was not discouraging. It was complicated. It was difficult. Dale Pruitt was still out there with his plan and his land holdings, and his feed store contacts, and his ability to be patient in the way that men with resources are patient. The bank review was in a year. The winter had months left in it. Iris still needed watching. The colt was early and small, and the first weeks were always uncertain. The whole picture also had a south fence that stood straight in the aftermath of the worst blizzard in 3 decades. It had a colt breathing in a clean stall beside his dam. It had a document case in the kitchen drawer that Clara had organized with the kind of thoroughness that would matter when Morrison arrived in February. It had a woman who sat across this table every evening and knew which numbers were real and which were noise, and who had never once in 6 weeks pretended that things were better than they were. Colt, he said. Clara looked up. I think I'll call him December. He paused. It's what he came through. She considered it. December Caldwell, she said, as if trying the sound of it. Just December. He doesn't need a last name. The corner of her mouth moved in the way he'd come to understand was as close as she came to a full smile without provocation. December, she agreed. They sat for another few minutes without speaking. Stove breathed evenly. The kitchen was warm. From somewhere outside, carrying in the still post-blizzard air, there was the faint sound of cattle moving in the south pasture, which meant the fence was holding, and the herd was where it was supposed to be, which on a cattle ranch in December after a 3-foot snow is exactly the sound you want to hear. Then Clara said, Someone came to Granger's yesterday when I went in for the flour. He waited. A woman from the east side of town, Vera Mosler, I think her name is, married to the man who runs the harness shop. She came up to me while I was at the counter. Clara looked at her hands. She said she'd heard about the foal. She asked if I'd be willing to look at one of her horses, a gelding that's been off his feet. Ethan absorbed that. Vera Mosler was not someone he would have expected to approach Clara for anything. She was the wife of a man who'd laughed at Ethan's wedding announcement when it had gone around town. What did you say? He asked. I said I'd come by on Thursday if the roads were clear. Clara looked up. I want you to know I'm not going to start offering veterinary services to the town. That's not... She stopped and started again. But if someone asks and I can help, it seems wrong to refuse. It doesn't bother me, he said. It's your time to do with. It's also time that comes from this ranch. She was precise about what she owed and what she was choosing. So I'm telling you. He looked at her for a moment. I trust your judgment. She seemed briefly uncertain what to do with that, not the trust itself, which she accepted, but the completeness of it, as if she'd expected a qualification. All right, she said. She looked at the window. The moon was up, and the snow reflected it, turning the landscape into something that looked like it had been drawn rather than real blue and silver, still and enormous. You asked me, when I arrived, about what I was expecting here, she said. He waited. She didn't often circle back to things unprompted. I told you I expected to work. That was true. She kept looking at the window. But I didn't tell you what I expected it to feel like. What did you expect? To feel necessary, she said. Not comfortable. Not loved. Just needed. Useful in a real way, not a performing way. She paused. I haven't always had that. He thought about a husband who was interior and difficult to reach, 12 years of solo work on failing land, a society that had written its verdict on her before she'd had a chance to make her case. Have you got it here? He asked. What you expected? She turned from the window and looked at him. Yes, she said, more than I expected to. He nodded. And the moon kept its light on the snow outside, and the stove kept its heat inside. And somewhere in the barn, a colt named December slept in the straw beside his mother, and Red Hollow was already beginning, without quite knowing it, to shift the story it told about the woman at the Caldwell ranch, changing it slowly. The way people always change stories about people who've shown them something they didn't anticipate, grudgingly at first, then, with increasing conviction, then finally with the particular enthusiasm of those who want to claim they saw it coming. Ground was shifting. Dale Pruitt, in his comfortable house on the east edge of town, was reading his own correspondence that evening, a letter from the Billings law firm. He kept on retainer. which had been tracking the Morrison situation, which meant Dale knew Morrison was coming, which meant Dale's timeline had just compressed. He would need to move before February. What that move would look like, and who it would come for first, was the thing that Ethan and Clara hadn't yet calculated. They'd been building their defense with care and accuracy, and Dale Pruitt had noticed men, when they are the kind of man Dale was, do not sit back and admire the defense. They find the unguarded side. He sat in his chair and thought for a long time, and then he picked up his pen. Dale Pruitt's letter arrived at the county land office on a Thursday morning in the second week of January. Ethan didn't know about it until Friday afternoon, when Reuben Selby rode in from the north with the particular tight expression of a man delivering news he'd rather not carry. Reuben was Thomas Selby's son, less talkative than his father, more careful, the kind of man who chose his words the way a good carpenter chooses wood, for grain and durability rather than appearance. He tied his horse at the post and came to the yard and said without preamble that his father had heard something at the county office and had sent him over, then called Clara from the barn. They stood together in the yard while Reuben explained it. Dale Pruitt had filed a formal challenge to the water drainage rights on the Carver parcel. Now, Holloway Land Holdings claiming that the existing drainage arrangement had been informally established and never properly recorded, and that as the current owner of the upstream parcel, Holloway had the right to modify the drainage flow for agricultural development purposes. The challenge succeeded. Ethan's east parcel lost its reliable water access. In a dry year, that could make the difference between a functioning cattle operation and one that couldn't sustain its herd through summer. He filed it Thursday, Reuben said. My father thinks he timed it so it hit the county record before your lawyer gets here in February. Ethan looked at Clara. She was already thinking. He could see it, the still, inward-focused look she got when she was running through implications, faster than most people could track them. She'd been doing that since the day she arrived, and he'd learned not to interrupt it. Does your family have a recorded water arrangement with the Carver parcel? She asked Reuben. Verbal. Same as Ethan's. Same problem then. She looked at him directly. If Dale wins the challenge, it affects your north pasture access in a dry year too. Reuben's jaw tightened. Yes. Then you have standing to challenge alongside us. Reuben looked at Ethan. Ethan kept his expression neutral, because this was Reuben's decision, and pushing a man like Reuben Selby produced the opposite of the intended result. My father said the same thing, Reuben said, after a moment. He said to tell you we'd throw in together, if you were going to fight it. We're going to fight it, Ethan said. Reuben nodded once. He accepted the coffee Clara offered. She'd anticipated the conversation, going long enough to warrant it, and had gone in to put it on without being asked. And they sat at the kitchen table and went through what they knew. The county challenge process gave affected parties 30 days to respond with documentation of established usage. Morrison wasn't arriving until the first week of February, which gave them 3 weeks to prepare a response package that was stronger than what they currently had. Clara already had most of it. She went to the kitchen drawer while Reuben was still there and laid the documentation on the table, the water usage records she'd been compiling since November, the hand-drawn map of the drainage flow she'd made herself by walking the line in December before the blizzard, the letter exchanges with Morrison, and a separate page she'd written in her precise handwriting that outlined the chain of ownership of the Carver parcel, with dates, ending with the Holloway Land Holdings transfer and its proximity and timing to Dale Pruitt's bank connections. Reuben looked at the documentation for a long time without speaking. You put this together already, he said. Not a question. I suspected something like this was coming, Clara said. Carver parcel transfer was too convenient to be unrelated. Reuben looked at Ethan. Where did you find her? Marriage agency, Ethan said. Reuben looked back at Clara with the expression of a man who was filing something away under a category that needed significant expansion. He finished his coffee and stood up and said he'd have his father write out their own water usage history. going back as far as he could remember and get it to Ethan by the end of the week. After he'd gone, the kitchen was quiet for a moment. "You knew," Ethan said. "I thought it was likely." She gathered the documents and straightened them against the table edge. "Men like Dale don't wait. They move when they think you're not ready. He knows Morrison is coming in February. Filing in January makes sense if he wants to create a fait accompli before we can respond properly. Can we respond properly?" She looked at him steadily. "We already have. We just need Morrison to put the legal language around what we've already built." He looked at the stack of documents in her hands, weeks of careful, quiet work that she'd done without announcing it, without asking for credit, without even particularly mentioning it. Because she'd seen the threat coming, and she'd done what she did with every problem. She'd started on it before it became an emergency. He thought about the conversation they'd had in the barn. In October, the day she'd first said "we" without emphasis. Thought about the bank case, and the trough and December in the straw, and the gray heifer named Iris, who was now by all visible evidence going to produce a healthy calf in March. He thought about Reuben Selby's face when he'd looked at that documentation. He thought, she walked into this ranch with one trunk, and nobody in this town thought she was worth anything, and she has been quietly building the case that saves it for 3 months, and nobody saw it happening, except the people paying close enough attention. "Clara," he said. She looked up. "Morrison needs to know everything you know, not just the documents, your analysis. The Holloway connection, the timing, all of it." He held her gaze. "When he comes, I want you in the room." Something crossed her face briefly and quickly, the way things cross the faces of people who've learned not to show them. Caught it. A particular quality of relief that came from not having to argue for something she'd already known was right. "All right," she said. James Morrison arrived on a Tuesday, in the first week of February, 2 days earlier than expected because the roads had cleared. Better than anticipated, and he was the kind of man who considered arriving early a professional obligation. He was 60, compact, with the unhurried manner of someone who'd spent decades in rooms where losing was expensive, and had learned that panic was the first thing you had to manage. He read their documentation in the kitchen that first evening for 2 hours, while Ethan and Clara sat at the table with him and answered his questions. He was thorough in his questions and brief in his responses, which Clara matched exactly. She gave him what he asked for, didn't elaborate past the question, and didn't qualify things that didn't require qualification. At the end of 2 hours, Morrison set the papers down and folded his hands on the table. "The Holloway connection to Pruitt," he said. "How certain are you?" "Thomas Selby has verbal confirmation from the county clerk that the registration came through a Billslingsdress associated with Pruitt's feed operation expansion filings," Clara said. "It's not documentary proof, but the timeline is difficult to explain as coincidence." "I'll find the documentary proof," Morrison said. "That's what you're paying me for." He looked at the drainage map she'd drawn. "Accurate? I walked it in December, before the blizzard altered any ground features. You surveyed it yourself. I don't have a surveyor's certification, but I've walked drainage lines for 20 years. The map is accurate." Morrison looked at it again. "It'll need a certified survey to be fully admissible. I can arrange that." He set it down. "The Selby participation strengthens this considerably. 2 affected parties with documented usage histories make the challenge substantially harder to sustain." He looked at Ethan. "Pruitt knows this is going to get complicated. He may be hoping you'll settle rather than fight." "Kind of settlement," Ethan said. "A quiet deed transfer on the East 40. Low price. Pruitt gets the land and the water question goes away because he owns both sides." Morrison said it flatly. "It's a clean solution for him." "No," Ethan said. Morrison nodded as if he'd expected that. "Then we respond to the county challenge within the 30-day window. With a full documentation package, we petition for a certified survey, and we file a separate inquiry into the beneficial ownership of Holloway Land Holdings." He paused. "The last item is the one that will concern Pruitt most. He's been operating on the assumption that the Holloway structure provides adequate distance." "Will it?" Clara asked. Montana land law has limited patience for shell arrangements that obscure beneficial ownership in rights disputes. If we can establish that Holloway is Pruitt acting through an entity, the challenge loses its procedural standing. He looked at Clara with the direct, assessing gaze of someone who'd spent the last 2 hours updating his assessment of her. The documentation you've maintained is the best private preparation I've seen on a situation like this. You anticipated the relevant legal pressure points without knowing the law. I knew what the goal was, she said. I worked backward from there. Morrison considered that. Who taught you to think this way? Necessity, she said. He almost smiled. The best teacher. He gathered the documents and began returning them to their order. I'll need a week to prepare the response package. I'll work from Red Hollow. Rather than returning to Helena, I'd prefer to be available if Pruitt's attorneys make contact. He stayed at Granger's boarding room, which meant he was visible in Red Hollow, in a way that a lawyer from Helena visiting a struggling rancher's wife about a water rights challenge could not help but be visible. Word moved. It moved the way all word moved in Red Hollow, which was immediately and with elaboration. By Wednesday evening, Granger himself had asked Ethan careful, roundabout questions about the nature of the legal matter that Ethan had deflected with equal care. Thursday, Frank Delacroix had appeared at the ranch with the ostensible purpose of returning a second borrowed tool, a purpose so transparent that Ethan hadn't bothered to pretend he believed it and had said, over coffee, that people were talking about the Holloway business and that some of them were saying things about Dale Pruitt that they'd been not saying for several years. What kinds of things? Ethan said. That the Carver parcel wasn't the first one he bought through a company nobody could easily trace. Frank wrapped his hands around his cup. Walt Briggs at the hardware store, his family owned a piece of bottom land on the South Creek 4 years back. He sold it to a land company when things were tight. He's been thinking about that company lately. Clara was at the stove and said nothing, but Ethan saw her tilt her head, slightly absorbing it, filing it. Tell Walt that Morrison might want to talk to him, Ethan said. Frank nodded. He finished his coffee and looked at Clara, the Mosler horse. Vera told her sister, you fixed what Hendricks couldn't figure out in 2 visits. Clara turned around. The horse had a stone bruise that had been left to develop under the shoe. It wasn't complicated once you found it. Vera doesn't think it was uncomplicated. Vera is generous. Frank looked at her for a moment. A few people have asked me, since the blizzard, since word got around, about the foal. They've asked me what you're actually like. The real version, not the story that was going around at the beginning. Clara looked at him evenly. What do you tell them? I tell them you're the most competent person who's come to this county in 10 years, and that Ethan had better sense than any of us gave him credit for. He said it without particular ceremony, the way he'd have said a fence post needed replacing as plain, necessary fact. I also tell them you're not soft about it, and they shouldn't expect soft. That's accurate, she said. I know it is. He stood up and put his coat on. Morrison needs anything from me. Tell him I'll talk. He went out. Ethan looked at Clara. She was already turned back to the stove, but he could see from the angle of her shoulders that she was not unaffected. She was just characteristically not going to make a production of it. Morrison found the Holloway connection in 11 days. He didn't announce it dramatically. He simply came to the ranch on a Saturday morning with a file and laid it on the table and walked them through it in his methodical way. The registered agent for Holloway Land Holdings was a Billings attorney named Cassell, who appeared in 3 other land company registrations, 2 of which were directly connected to Pruitt's feed operations' documented expansion filings. The beneficial ownership wasn't explicit, it never was, in these arrangements, but the circumstantial chain was dense enough that Morrison was prepared to argue it in front of the county board with confidence. What happens when you argue it? Ethan said. Best case, the county board finds that the challenge lacks standing because the beneficial owner has an undisclosed conflict of interest with the challenged parties, and the drainage arrangement reverts to established usage. Morrison folded his hands. More likely case, Pruitt's attorneys settle before the board hearing to avoid the Holloway structure becoming a matter of public county record. That settlement would include dropping the challenge and some form of acknowledgement of the established water rights. And Dale? Clara said. Morrison looked at her. Dale Pruitt would lose the Carver parcel play entirely. He'd still own the land through Holloway or directly, but the water rights argument goes away, and the beneficial ownership exposure makes future shell arrangements more difficult. He'd be angry, Ethan said. Yes. Morrison didn't soften it. Men like Pruitt absorb losses by looking for the next leverage point. He'll be careful with you for a while, and then he'll look for another approach. He paused. The best protection you have against that is a ranch that doesn't need to be desperate. Desperate operations are the ones that attract opportunists. Clara looked at Ethan. He looked back at her. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that they understood exactly what a ranch that didn't need to be desperate required, had understood it since November, since the kitchen table sessions with the ledger, since the bank meeting in Billings, since the documentation work that had made this moment possible. Morrison filed the response to the county challenge on the 28th day of the 30-day window, which was deliberate. He'd explained that filing at the last moment made it harder for the opposing party to prepare a counter-response in the same cycle. The certified survey came back confirming Clara's hand-drawn map to within acceptable margin. The Selby family's documentation went in alongside. Then they waited. Waiting on a working ranch in February was not the same as waiting elsewhere. The days were full. The bred heifers needed constant watching as March approached. December was growing faster than his early arrival had suggested he would. The supply runs to town continued. Ongoing mechanical maintenance of a working operation didn't pause for legal proceedings. Clara drove herself through it all the way she'd driven herself through everything since October, without visible flagging, without complaint, with the occasional sign of human limitation, the back that bothered her in the cold, the right hand that had never quite healed to what it had been, before the trough installation, acknowledged and then set aside. Iris dropped her calf on a Tuesday in early March, at 4 a.m, without drama. Ethan found them when he went in for the morning, checked the calf already standing, Iris already cleaned and eating, stood in the stall doorway for a moment, with the lantern, and felt something uncomplicated and real satisfaction. Not triumph, just the solid, grounded feeling of a thing that was supposed to happen happening right. He went and woke Clara, which she'd made him promise to do for the calving events, because she wanted to see them. She came down in her coat over her nightclothes. He'd seen her like that before. The practical disregard for appearances when something mattered more, and stood beside him in the stall doorway and looked at Iris and the calf. Female, she said, noting it with the experienced eye that still caught him off guard sometimes. Yeah, she's strong. Good pause. Iris did it clean. Didn't need anything. Clara nodded. She stood for another minute. Then she said, "You should go back to sleep." "So should you." "I'll check the others first, Clara." She looked at him. 3 a.m. The Danver heifer has been restless for 2 days. I want to look at her. She held his gaze with the patient, slightly immovable expression that he'd learned was not stubbornness exactly, but something more like "this is who I am," and arguing about it at 3 a.m. serves neither of us. "Go to sleep. I'll be in by 5. He went to sleep. She was in by 4:30. Pruitt's attorneys made contact on a Thursday in the 3rd week of March. Not with Morrison, with Ethan, directly, which was the kind of procedural discourtesy that Morrison described as deliberate and predictable. The attorney, a man named Croft, who came from Billings and wore a suit that cost more than most Red Hollow residents made in a month, arrived at the ranch without prior notice and stood in the yard and said that his client was prepared to offer a resolution. Ethan said he'd get his wife. Croft's expression shifted very slightly at the word wife, the residual adjustment that people still occasionally made when connecting that word to what they knew about the arrangement. He managed it quickly. Clara came out and stood beside Ethan and looked at Croft with the patient, measuring expression that had, by now, made more than one person in Red Hollow significantly revise their initial assumptions. The resolution Croft proposed, Holloway Land Holdings would withdraw the water rights challenge in exchange for a right of first refusal agreement on the East 40 parcel if Ethan ever chose to sell. No money changed hands. No admission of anything on either side. Ethan looked at Clara. She said without looking at him, "No right of first refusal." Croft directed his response to Ethan, which was a choice that Clara let pass, without visible reaction. "A significant concession my client is offering. Your client is withdrawing a challenge he can't win in exchange for an option on land he's wanted for 6 years," Clara said, still not particularly raising her voice. "That's not a concession. That's a renegotiated version of the same play." Croft looked at her, then he looked at Ethan. Ethan kept his expression neutral. "The challenge withdrawal only then," Clara said. "Clean. Documented acknowledgement of established water usage rights on both affected parcels. No conditions. My client won't agree to." "Then we'll see him at the county board hearing." She said it the way you'd say pass the salt, no drama, no heat, just fact. "Tell him the Selby documentation is in the file too, and the certified survey." Croft left without concluding anything. Morrison, when told, said they'd hear back within the week. He was right. They heard back in 4 days a formal letter from Croft's firm stating that Holloway Land Holdings was withdrawing the water rights challenge, with a separate attached document that Morrison had specifically insisted on acknowledged the established historical usage of the drainage by both the Caldwell and Selby properties. It wasn't everything. Dale Pruitt still owned the Carver parcel through Holloway. He still ran his feed operation. He was still the kind of man who thought in long plans and absorbed setbacks by looking for the next angle. But the East 40 was safe. The water access was recorded. Morrison filed the acknowledgement with the county the same afternoon it arrived, which made it part of the permanent record in a way that would follow any future ownership of the upstream parcel. It was done. Ethan was at the county office when Morrison filed it, and he drove home in the late afternoon light of a March day that had, for the first time in months, the tentative warmth of something that was thinking about becoming spring. The snow was retreating from the south-facing slopes. The road had mud in it, which was annoying in the practical sense and not unwelcome in the larger one. He found Clara in the south pasture, walking the fence line. Not because anything was wrong with the fence it had held through the winter without another failure, the repair they'd done together in October having proven sound. She walked it periodically the way she did everything, with the belief that problems caught early were easier than problems caught late, and that the walk itself was not wasted time, but information. He walked out to meet her. She saw him coming, and read something in the way he was moving, because she stopped and waited, one hand on the fence wire. "Done," he said. She let out a breath, slow and controlled, but a real breath, the kind that carries weight in it. Morrison filed it 20 minutes ago. It's in the county record. She looked out at the pasture for a moment. The cattle were spread across it in the particular loose formation of animals that were content and not worried about anything, which, on a cattle ranch, is the most reassuring sight in the world. "The bank review is in 6 months," she said. "I know. The spring calf crop will be the key number. We need 7 healthy calves minimum to make the projection we gave Brigg defensible. We have 4 on the ground already. The Danver heifer is close. And the 2 I'm watching in the north group, I think they're both further along than you thought when we counted in January." He looked at her. She was already calculating forward, the way she always was, not savoring the resolution behind them, not even fully allowing herself the moment, because there was already a next thing, and the next thing required attention. Put his hand over hers on the fence wire. She went still. He wasn't a man who made gestures like that easily. She wasn't a woman who received them easily. They stood at the fence line in the thin March warmth with his hand over hers, and neither of them moved for a moment. "I need to say something," he said. She waited. "When I wrote to the agency, I told them I was looking for someone capable." He looked at the pasture, rather than at her, because saying this while looking at her directly was beyond what he could currently manage. I told myself that was what I needed. Someone capable. Someone who understood hardship. He paused. I didn't tell myself. I didn't let myself say that I was also lonely. That 9 years was a long time to be alone in a house, and I was stopped. I was tired of it. Clara was quiet. I'm not tired of it anymore, he said. I want you to know that. Not because you fixed the barn and built the bank case and saved December and fought off Dale Pruitt. He paused. Because you're the person you are, and I'm glad you're here, in a way that's more than the ranch. He finally looked at her. Her expression was the thing he'd come to understand, as her version of being moved, not tearful, not dramatic, but deeply and visibly present, as if she'd turned her full attention to something and was letting herself feel it without managing it away. I told myself I came here to be necessary, she said. Her voice was level, but carrying something. I told myself I wasn't expecting anything beyond that I was past the age where you expected. She stopped and began again. I've been wrong about what I expected before. This is one of the times I'm glad I was. He turned his hand and she turned hers, and they stood there together at the repaired fence line with the spring light on the pasture and the cattle moving slowly in the distance. Two imperfect people who had arrived at something real through the unglamorous, daily, frequently frustrating work of simply showing up and doing the next necessary thing. It wasn't the story anyone in Red Hollow had told about them in October. It was better than that. The spring advanced. Iris's calf grew fast and healthy, a heifer calf, deep red like her mother, who Clara called Autumn without consulting anyone, and Ethan accepted without comment. The Danver heifer dropped twins in the second week of April, which nobody had predicted, least of all the Danver heifer, who seemed genuinely surprised by the development and required significant assistance sorting out her maternal responsibilities. Both twins lived. Clara spent 2 days managing the nursing arrangement with the patience and creative stubbornness of someone who was not going to lose a set of twins because the mother was confused. By the end of April, they had 11 calves on the ground. Bank projection had required 7. Vera Mosler's gelding recovered fully, and Vera told anyone who would stand still long enough to listen that Clara Caldwell had more practical knowledge in her hands than most men accumulated in a lifetime. Statement that was received with varying degrees of comfort depending on who was hearing it. But that was, as statements went, accurate. Walt Briggs from the hardware store came to Morrison about the land company that had bought his family's South Creek parcel 4 years ago. Morrison looked into it. The company was not Holloway Land Holdings, but the registered agent was the same Billings attorney, Cassell. Morrison filed that information in a place where it would be useful if Pruitt ever tried another play. Frank Delacroix and Ethan mended a shared fence line in May, the way neighbors do, trading labor, not money, arriving at each other's properties on the same morning without extensive prior arrangement. Frank brought his son, who was 12 and hadn't met Clara before, and watched her redirect a stray heifer back through a gate, with a matter-of-factness that suggested he was revising something in his understanding of what women could do on a working ranch. That seemed right, Ethan thought. Start them young with better information. Thomas Selby came to supper in June and sat at the kitchen table and told stories about the county's water disputes going back 40 years with the detail and pleasure of a man whose memory was one of his great remaining joys. Clara listened to all of it and asked questions that made the old man straighten slightly, pleased to be asked things that required real knowledge to answer. After he'd gone, Ethan cleared the plates, and Clara washed up, and the kitchen was warm and full of the good smell of the meal, and the evening light was coming in at the angle that meant summer was close. He liked you, Ethan said. He likes anyone who takes his knowledge seriously. She handed him a plate to dry. It's a fair thing to like. You take everyone's knowledge seriously. I take useful knowledge seriously. There's a difference. She handed him another plate. Thomas Selby has been watching this county's water table for 40 years. That's not nothing. He dried the plate. What did you learn from him tonight that you didn't know before? She considered. that the Selby Creek drainage ran stronger 20 years ago than it does now, that the change happened in the decade after the North Timber claims were logged. She handed him the last dish, and that the Carver parcel, before the family that sold it to Holloway owned it, had a different drainage channel that was redirected in the 1870s. He looked at her. Is that legally relevant? I don't know yet. I've written it down. She dried her hands. It might be nothing. It might matter someday. He thought about the drawer in the kitchen where the documentation lived, which had grown from a folder to a full accordion file, organized in Clara's precise handwriting with dates and sources and cross-references. He thought about a woman who'd spent 12 years running a Nebraska farm alone, learning everything that could be learned because there was no one to learn it for her, and who had carried all of that accumulated knowing into a Montana ranch and applied it so quietly and so completely that the people who dismissed her at the beginning were still, some of them, in the process of understanding what they'd underestimated. He thought about Dale Pruitt, who sat in his comfortable house on the east edge of town and had not made another move since March, which Morrison said meant he was regrouping rather than giving up, which meant they stayed careful. Life didn't resolve Dale Pruitt's permanently. It made them more cautious and sent them looking for the next opportunity, and the best defense against that was exactly what Clara had said months ago. A ranch that didn't need to be desperate. The Caldwell ranch in June was not desperate. It was not thriving in any grand photographable sense. The house still had places where the winters showed. The operation was solvent, but not comfortable. The bank review still coming in the fall. The margin between secure and uncertain still thinner than Ethan would have liked. There was real work left to do, and there would be real work after that. But the pastures were green in the specific vivid way that Montana manages in early summer, when the grass has been waiting all winter and finally gets its chance. December was 5 months old and growing into the promise of a fine horse, still awkward, still figuring out what his legs were for, but with his mother's shoulder and his father's breadth already visible in the lines of him. Iris's calf played in the south pasture with the concentrated absurdity of young cattle who have not yet developed the dignity to pretend they're not playing. And at the kitchen table, in the evenings, two people sat with whatever was between them, which had not been named and did not require naming, which was simply real in the way that things built slowly and honestly tend to be real, and talked about the things that needed doing and sometimes about things that didn't need doing at all. And the house had the particular feeling of a place where someone had decided to stay. Clara had a sister in Ohio she wrote to. Occasionally, Ethan had learned this gradually as he'd learned most things about her. The sister was younger, married with children, living the settled life that Clara had not lived. He'd ask once carefully whether Clara regretted the path her life had taken versus the path her sister had. She'd thought about it seriously the way she thought about everything. Seriously. I regret the drought, she'd said finally. I regret that Samuel and I never had enough time. After he finally opened up, he was better at it, at the end. I regret some years in Nebraska where I was so tired. I stopped paying attention to things I should have paid attention to. She'd paused. I don't regret the work. I don't regret knowing what I know. I don't regret being the person who can walk into a failing ranch in October and understand what it needs. Looked at him then. I don't regret being here. He'd nodded. He hadn't said what he was thinking, which was that the world had done her a significant injustice by spending so many years looking past her, and that the world's loss had, in the end, been his extraordinary and undeserved good fortune. He hadn't said it then. But some things don't need to be said in the moment, because they're being demonstrated constantly in every morning's work, and every shared supper, and every problem approached together rather than alone. That's what she'd taught him, among other things. That's what 12 years of difficulty, and a woman who'd refused to be diminished by them, had produced. A kind of knowledge that doesn't announce itself, doesn't ask to be recognized, but is simply there in the repaired fence, and the documented water rights, and the colt growing in the pasture, and the heifer calf named Autumn playing in the summer grass. There's a particular failure of imagination that the world commits regularly and with confidence against people of a certain age, a certain weathering, a certain distance from conventional prettiness or conventional usefulness. The world looks at what has been used and assumes it is used up. The world looks at what has survived difficulty and sees only the difficulty, not the survival. Clara Whitmore had been looked at that way most of her adult life. A farming man's daughter who grew into a farming man's wife, who grew into a widow with no children and failing land and gray hair and hands that showed their decades. She'd been passed over and written off and, in the end, nearly prevented from arriving at the one place where all of it, every hard year, every skill acquired from necessity, every problem solved without help, because there was no help turned out to matter completely. Dale Pruitt had written a letter to stop her from coming. The letter had failed. The water rights challenge had failed. Bank pressure had failed. Not because fate intervened, but because a woman who knew what she knew had done the work methodically and documented it carefully, and stood at a fence line on a cold March afternoon without moving, when a man who'd decided too late that she was worth listening to put his hand over hers. The summer moved through its long, bright days. The bank review in September went well. Aldous Brigg, who had not been surprised by the 11 calves, and who had apparently been told something by someone about the water rights matter, proved the modified schedule continuation without conditions. Morrison sent a bill and a note saying that if anything further developed on the Holloway front, he was available. Ethan paid the bill and put Morrison's note in the accordion file. In October, 1 year after Clara had stepped off the buckboard in his yard and noticed his horse's lameness before she'd set down her bag, Ethan Caldwell stood at the kitchen window in the early morning with his coffee and watched the south pasture in the thin autumn light. The fence line was straight. The cattle were where they should be. December was in the near paddock, not quite grown, not quite a horse yet, finding his way between those two states with the particular grace of creatures that don't know enough yet to be self-conscious about the process. Clara came downstairs and poured her coffee and stood beside him at the window. They stood like that for a while, looking at the same pasture, thinking about different things, and maybe the same things, in the comfortable silence of people who had stopped performing anything for each other a long time ago. "The north fence needs looking at before the first snow," she said. "I know tomorrow I'll come." "I know that too," he said. Outside, the autumn light moved across the pasture in the slow way of October light, which has more gold in it than any other month, and doesn't last as long and is worth paying attention to when you have it. Neither of them moved from the window. The cattle grazed. December lifted his head and looked at something in the middle distance with the alert, slightly puzzled expression of a young horse discovering that the world is larger than the paddock and that most of it is worth investigating. He was right about that. They both knew it.